We are about to talk about Bernie Sanders. And as always, even if I have to do it several times in the show, my disclaimer, I work for Bernie Sanders. And because I do, I'm happy with a recent development that we're going to hear more about right now. Ben Wikler, who's our good friend of the program and of the station and of the progressive movement, is the Washington director for MoveOn.org. He helps make sure that the 8 million members of that progressive community has its voices and views heard here in Washington, D.C., and Ben is also the host of the well-known podcast, The Good Fight, and he joins us now. Ben, thanks for coming on the program.
So this is an exciting week for us. We put out the call last week to our membership at MoveOn to decide whether MoveOn should endorse. One option was do not endorse now, or who we should endorse in the Democratic primary. And it was a vote of our membership. Only members could vote, so this wasn't something that people could swarm into to pack in one direction or another.
Right.
And what we found was a 78.6% landslide to endorse Bernie Sanders for president.
Did that surprise you, Ben? I know you could have predicted this going one or another way. I think the way it worked was that first of all, that you needed a 2/3 majority or 66% in order a vote on one campaign's behalf or another in order to endorse. But did the magnitude of the landslide come as a surprise to you guys?
I have to say it was a bigger showing than we had expected. And the threshold was high. 2/3 is no mean feat to get for any candidate. And we knew our members were passionate about Sanders. There's also a lot of support for Clinton, and some members thought, this isn't like the right thing. We should wait and see how things play out. So I don't think we knew in advance that it was going to clear the threshold, and we certainly had no idea it was going to be almost 79%. That's a record-breaking showing for any Democratic primary candidate. The only other time when we've endorsed in a presidential race was for Barack Obama, and he got 70%.
Right, and I think you had a vote, if I recall correctly, MoveOn had a vote in 2004, and nobody made the 66% hurdle. Is that right?
That's right. Howard Dean had a plurality. I think he had 43 or 44. So we didn't endorse in the 2004 Democratic primary.
So here you had this huge turnout for Bernie, a kind of Bernie wave among the membership, and you also tracked, I think, people's reasons for voting for Bernie, and maybe some of the commentary as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had an after-vote poll, so we got tons and tons of feedback from people. And what we found is that MoveOn members love Sanders because they love his message, the issues he's running on, and the issues he's putting on the table. There's this whole range of policies and ideas that are actually really popular around the country, but are almost never talked about in DC political circles. And that's stuff like expanding Social Security or a single-payer healthcare system. These are ideas that have tremendous support and are sort of off limits because everyone knows in their cynical way that DC is so controlled by the power of billionaires and by special interest groups that there's no way these things could move forward. And what Sanders is doing is saying, look, if we can elect me, if we'll have the kind of grassroots movement, the movement that would elect me is the kind of movement that would bring change to our legislature and that could help move these things through. And he's saying, if I'm elected, I'm not just going to be a president who goes to DC and then takes things from there. Like, this movement will have to stay engaged. And I think that's a message that people are hungry to hear. And these are policies people are really hungry to see enacted to confront the fundamental inequality, not just economically, but the inequality of political power that's meant that a small group of people call the shots so much of the time in our system.
It struck me, and we're talking with Ben Wikler, who's the Washington director of MoveOn.org and host of the podcast The Good Fight. It strikes me, Ben, that in a way, it's a natural fit, Bernie Sanders and MoveOn, because Bernie's entire campaign and its entire kind of theory of politics, if you will, is based on this notion of political revolution, or the idea that he always says, let's be honest. I can't do it. No president can do it unless there is a mobilized citizenry standing up, 1 million people saying that we demand this. Maybe 1 million people coming to Washington and saying we demand these things, and getting involved at every level in the electoral process, and certainly at the congressional level. So it strikes me now as I think about it, things always make sense in retrospect, at least for me sometimes. But Kierkegaard said life can only be understood backwards, but you have to live it forwards. that as I look back on this vote, it seems to me that it's a natural fit because MoveOn is a bottom-up grassroots movement, and what Bernie's really saying is that a political leader needs the partnership of a grassroots movement. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly right. Senator Sanders is one of a handful of senators, and I'd also put Elizabeth Warren on this list, a few others, who, after getting elected to the Senate, didn't just go and make votes and work the inside game. He's also consistently worked the outside game, meaning he's had calls with MoveOn members to mobilize action on money and politics issues, on a range of the bills that he proposes, and he's always looking for ways to communicate outside the bubble, not just through Politico, but directly with activists and citizens around the country to get them involved. And that's a strategy that's, I think, powerful legislatively. And it's even more powerful in a presidential campaign and even more powerful than that with a presidency. The few times when you've seen President Obama really put out the call to the public to get involved, you've seen a huge response. Right. But it's not part of most lawmakers' toolkits to, think about people that they don't interact with on a regular basis. I think one kind of structural thing that I just love so much is that Sanders doesn't have a finance team at all. So he's not giving preferential access to major donors. He's not spending time, call time talking to millionaires who might write him $2,600 checks. His entire fundraising operation is a grassroots online campaign. That's very familiar to MoveOn members. And I think a lot of MoveOn members are probably on the Sanders email list and are chipping in already.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That he doesn't have a finance team. That I hadn't really even thought about it that way, but I do know that when I joined the campaign, which was pretty much the beginning, that the smart talk in Washington was, well, he doesn't have a chance, and one of the reasons he doesn't have, he's not going to break 5 percentage points in the polls, and of course now he's breathing down the front runner's neck, but one of the reasons that was going to happen is, look, how much money can you really raise with this kind of grassroots internet people to people approach? And the answer is a lot.
A lot. That's absolutely right. I mean, I think it's so interesting seeing how much conventional wisdom is being punctured and overturned on both sides of the race, frankly. But what we've seen over and over is people underestimating the level of passion that he'll be able to tap into and what the collective action of millions of people can actually do. It's like DC is just surprised over and over that if you actually have, 1 million people chipping in online, you can raise serious money for a political campaign that doesn't spend any time courting, the likes of Sheldon Adelson. That's a huge, conventional wisdom burster. And they're surprised at the giant crowds that turn out. And I think the next surprise will be how those crowds and how those online donors turn into actual caucus goers and votes. MoveOn has 43,000 members in Iowa. We have 30,000 members in New Hampshire. Our focus is going to be making sure that MoveOn members get involved in the caucus and in the primary in those 2 early states. And there's a lot of other folks beyond MoveOn. There's Democracy for America, and there's the Sanders campaign, and a whole basically any large collection of grassroots progressive activists is getting engaged in some way at this point. That stuff really adds up. It's not an illusion. These crowds aren't coming just to gawk at a celebrity. They're actually there because they care about a message and a movement that can change their lives and change the world.
We're talking with Ben Wikler, who is the Washington director of MoveOn.org and the host of The Good Fight. That's exactly where I was going to pivot now. Okay, so Bernie's got this endorsement, and I know you guys were absolutely above board about remaining neutral in the voting process itself, but now Bernie's got the endorsement. So what happens next?
So now we have a laser focus on getting MoveOn members to the caucuses and to the polls. And that means one thing inside of these early states and one thing in the rest of the country. Inside these states, it means doing everything we can, not just by email, but also through phone calls, through organizing and all the traditional and the new media ways to get everyone who's local plugged in directly with the campaign as volunteers and also plugged in to a voter turnout operation to make sure they show up. Outside of these states, it's a matter of raising money for the campaign, and it's also a matter of organizing calling parties across the country to call MoveOn members in Iowa and New Hampshire. This is something we pioneered with the Obama campaign, is distributed call parties reaching people in crucial swing states so that we can get the kind of individual interactions that lead to people deciding to make the trip out to the caucus or the primary polling place. If we can get a chunk of those 43,000 folks in Iowa, maybe who've never been involved in a caucus before, but who've been active on the kinds of issues that Sanders has always fought for, if we can get them to the caucuses, I think that can make a crucial difference.
And I think a lot of our listeners don't realize, Ben Wikler, that in a caucus state, as opposed to a primary state, a typical primary state, you don't go in and cast your vote and go home. You go to a caucus, you attend a caucus, there are votes, there's kind of like a town hall voting kind of process. So if you can get people to go out and mobilize a few thousand folks even, that can make a big difference, right?
It absolutely can. So the caucus process is kind of an amazing little mini democracy lab in Iowa. People go and they get into these meetings, and then they actually discuss in the room who should vote for, who they should vote for. People make arguments, they make their case. Sometimes people change their allegiance based on the kind of case that other people make. And then at the end, they all, basically cast their dice. They make their votes known, and then the votes are tallied up. So it's a deliberative process, and that's the kind of process where people poo-poo the idea of preaching to the choir, but in this case, you need a really good choir because they're actually going to be singing. Like the choir in Iowa, for each candidate, gets a chance to make their case to the other folks who show up at the caucuses, and that all happens right before the vote. In a primary, you just go and you go into an anonymous little box and you mark a piece of paper and nobody sees it and you put it into the machine. It's very different if you're attending a caucus and there's other people in the room.
Right, and Diebold can't tinker with the results either. But so another thing I wanted to ask you, Ben Wikler, I was just curious about this. You had to be a member of MoveOn to vote. I already was a member, but did a lot of people join MoveOn so that they could have the opportunity to vote here?
So MoveOn conducted our online poll in an unusual way. We restricted it only to existing MoveOn members.
Okay.
And that was there. I think probably some people that joined in the days preceding the vote because they wanted to participate. But we have 8 million members, and we did not see a big uptick in membership right before the vote. So these are folks who've been involved in MoveOn for a while. My 4-year-old son is joining us here for a moment.
Good.
Mac, we're talking about the presidential race and MoveOn.org's endorsement of Bernie Sanders for president.
He's welcome to come on and say, "Feel the burn."
Do you want to say "Feel the burn," Mackie?
Feel the burn.
Good
Feel
man.
the burn. That's right.
Great. We'll be sure to get you a copy of this so you can play it for him later.
Thank you.
You know what? The next generation of Wiklers in broadcasting has just stepped up to the plate. So, well, that's good to know in a way.
I want to join Dad.
Well, is that question for you or for me?
No, Mac was just saying I want to join Dad, but he's going to play with his mom.
Oh, okay. All right. Because I was prepared to field questions from him. I love kids, actually.
Appreciate it.
But I guess my last observation, I actually like the fact that it's existing MoveOn members in a way because and that it was such an overwhelming vote because MoveOn.org's members are committed, long-term participants in the progressive movement. That's how I think of them. So if that dedicated activist base feels so strongly about Bernie Sanders, to me, that's a great sign of things to come.
I'm totally with you. MoveOn's been around for 17 years. We actually started with a campaign to fight against the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. So It's not like MoveOn has always been on one side of Clinton-related fights. And in fact, we're running an entirely positive campaign. This is a campaign that's fundamentally about the issues that Sanders stands for and the movement that his campaign and he are building around those issues. Those are things that we have been in the fight for years on, fighting side by side with Sanders, and will be there for years going forward, hopefully with the President Sanders. So this is absolutely a case of people who have an enduring commitment and interest in making this country a better and more just place and de-rigging the system, taking action in the best way they know how in this presidential primary.
Well, I'm thrilled that this has taken place and that MoveOn is going to be part of this exciting historical moment. I'm appreciative that you've come on the program to talk to us about it. And as always, Ben Wikler, Washington Director of MoveOn.org and host of The Good Fight. Great to talk to you.
Great being here. Thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you.